Okay. Great. Well, thanks so much for coming despite the weather. I'm a California native who now lives in Cambridge, and last night at the dog park, I had a rookie moment where I was trying to convince a native Boston guy that cold was better than was worse than snow, I should say. And he said, "You don't have to shovel cold," which I discovered this morning. So you guys are all brave to be here. We really appreciate it. And we're talking about a very complex topic, so I'm going to just take a second to define our topic as best I can. Whoops. And real quick, I'm Julia Freeland. I am a research fellow at the Christensen Institute, which is a nonprofit think tank that researches disruptive innovation in education. And I've spent the past year and a half researching competency-based approaches around sort of the New England area. And the reason I wanted to put this definition up, this is from Competency Works, which is a nonprofit that sort of acts as a clearinghouse of a lot of the information about the theme we're talking about today, is that I think sometimes when we talk about competency-based learning, particularly the folks here at this conference, can tend to focus on the first 3 bullets or so of this definition, which are a lot about flexible pacing and on-demand assessment. There's obvious reasons why edtech is sort of drawn to those opportunities in a new paradigm of teaching and learning. But as you'll hear about today also, we want to emphasize that competency-based learning also has to do with what students are asked to learn and how they're asked to demonstrate their learning. So I just want to I'm not going to belabor the details of the definition, but just to say if you're an edtech entrepreneur, you may be thinking of it just in terms of pacing, and we're going to try and flesh out the other components of a competency-based system. Real quick, just to get a sense of who's in the room. Are there any educators here? Great. Entrepreneurs? Wow. Investors? Okay. You've identified yourself now. Don't swarm them. Okay, I'm sure I missed other categories. Students, I guess. Other students. Great. Okay. Okay. So now that we've sort of laid out the definition, the idea that in a competency-based system, students are advancing upon mastery, they're getting assessed differently, and they're hopefully demonstrating mastery perhaps in new ways that traditional systems don't ask them to, I want to actually dig in on what's very different in a competency-based system. And I've divided our panel somewhat artificially into 2 camps. One is the demand side, so school folks, and we have to my left Alison Hramiec, who's the director of curriculum at Boston Day and Evening Academy, a competency-based high school here in Roxbury. And at the end of the table, we have Tom Raffio, who's on the State Board of Education in New Hampshire, which is the first state to have fully gone competency-based at the high school level. So I'm going to start with them, and then we'll turn to our supply side in the middle here. So Alison, walk us through what is fundamentally different for a student who goes to Boston Day and Evening as opposed to a traditional high school here in Boston.
Hello. Okay. Welcome, everyone. So when we started our school 17 years ago as a competency-based school, it was well before all of the technology that has come about. And we started the school recognizing 2 things, that students were coming to us with different levels of understanding. So the grade level or the age did not dictate the content or the skill that they knew. And the other thing that we realized was that students were coming to us and learning at different paces. And in different content areas. So a student could come to us in math and be at grade level or really competent in algebra, while another student could enter the school and still be at a lower level skill. So can you go on to the next slide?
Oh, yeah.
So we designed our school to meet those students' needs. And so as a competency-based school, So in Boston, we have autonomies from the district. We're a Boston public school, but we have a lot of autonomies to create the school differently. And it's going to be a little bit different than what Tom's going to describe. So when students come in, we do a really solid assessment of their skill. We use a whole bunch of different data points. We do an in-house diagnostic and external diagnostic. We look at their test scores on the state tests, and then we look at their transcripts. Based on that information, we then place them into a class. So we don't place students into class based on age or grade level. We break up our year-long courses. So one of the things that we are finding about students is that year-long courses, during that time period, some students would move faster and some would move slower. So we broke up the year actually into 3 modules. And that's, I think, a lot of the online curriculum is doing the same thing, they're modules of learning. which makes a lot of sense, but schools are not still set up that way. So students are then placed into classes. So I could come to Boston Day and Evening and be really strong in math, and I can be placed further along in what we call our roadmap to graduation in math, but my English skills could still be really low, and I'll start at the beginning. So traditionally, a ninth grader enters high school and they get put into all the same level courses. That's not true in our competency-based program. We put the students in what we call their learning edge, so it's not too hard, it's not too easy. And then they have really clear competencies in those courses that they need to practice, and then demonstrate on a summative assessment. There's no such thing as failure, so we eliminate that. So that's one big thing about competency-based is it's just keep working on it until you've mastered it and you're ready to demonstrate it. And I think those are the main differences. And we
Great.
can come back and forth.
Yeah, we'll hear more about your sort of student experience. So, Tom, shifting to the kind of state level, New Hampshire has been a leader for over a decade and sort of pushing this as a policy agenda, but I'd love to hear sort of knowing that in 2000, so they passed a regulation in 2005 mandating that all high schools by 2008 would measure high school credit in terms of mastery rather than instructional hours, right? So to go back to my original cartoon, if anyone got the reference, they sort of took schools off the clock, which is traditionally how we measure credit. For a student and maybe even a teacher now in New Hampshire, what does that mean day to day?
Great. Welcome, everybody, and glad you could all make it here. It was fun coming down from New Hampshire this morning. And I get to wear this tie. We start off every state board of education. We look at our mission and vision, and we really are all about the children. Julie did a great job of describing what happened in 2005. I'm going to get very specific, as I was requested to do, but I do want to give you a little bit of the vision and why a CEO of a dental insurance company is sitting before you. So let's start way back. In my high school yearbook, it said I wanted to be a teacher. And so I found, though, I got into business and I could teach. So I have a real passion for teaching. So back in 2007, just when that 2005 project was being completed, and it's it's called the Blue Book. This is New Hampshire's vision for redesign. So it took all of the flexible minimum standards that Julia mentioned, allowing, it's all competency-based, extended learning opportunities, all the flexible rules. I came on right as we were completing that. And the then governor, Governor Lynch, said, we really want to bring someone on the board that has sort of a business acumen and can help us implement this. Because as you'll hear, particularly when I talk about the technology to support it, we still have a long way to go. We have the right vision. The former Governor Lynch was pro-education. Maggie Hassan, the current governor, is pro-education. We have board members that just love this topic. I got involved. I see Ann over there, but I got involved because one of the former board members, Fred Bramante, was a child. He ended up being a CEO, but he flunked out of traditional high school, and he always wanted to say, hey, we really need to get into personalized learning, and he really wanted me to. He said, you went to Harvard, and I did many years ago. He said, you have to take the lead on getting rid of the Carnegie unit. So that's kind of the background. And every 7 years, we have to revamp what Julia described. So just this last year, we completed the second version of the redesign, and it was just more support of extended learning opportunities, competency-based. There's one part of the state board that's very important to note, which is that we're also in New Hampshire responsible not only for K through 12, but we take the holistic view of also 0 to 4. I'm on the board of Early Learning New Hampshire, but also we're responsible for the preparatory training that at colleges and universities in their courses. So we're doing a much better job now of being rigorous to make sure that when UNH or Plymouth State, all of the universities and colleges in New Hampshire, when they bring programs to us involving teacher preparation, there's no rubber stamping of that. We make sure because one of my colleagues always says it's fine that you have rules and regulations and so forth that are really flexible, but if teachers are still teaching an old school, it's not going to happen. So that's my role as chair of the state board. I spend a lot of time in the field. The worst part of the job of being chair of the state board, there's a certain amount of bureaucracy and appeals you have to hear. The fun part is meeting with teachers and students. We often do our board meetings at local schools. I take it really serious to get to know teachers and students. So in preparing for today's session, I went back to all of the schools that I know that have truly have the leadership and have genuinely done competency-based education. And I'll give you a sampling of, we'll read some quotes both from teachers and from students. So this is Pittsfield, New Hampshire. It is probably one of the poorest areas in New Hampshire. So it's not about wealth. They have great leadership. So this is how their teachers answered this questions for me. How are students experiencing schools differently? Student control over how they demonstrate mastery of course competencies. So as one example, Sarah achieved senior English credit through personalized focus on American Sign Language. Student exploration of topics that a small school can't provide courses for. So for example, Bobby, and these are all real students, I've just changed their name, achieved science credit for his summer work in the UNH genetics lab. Liz did an internship with the Chichester Animal Hospital due to her interest in veterinary science, but she discovered that she couldn't really deal with euthanasia, so she decided to pursue a different field. Brendan received social studies credit for his study of the biblical Abraham and Abraham's impact on the contemporary world, which included his interviewing of religious leaders from 3 major world religions. And for the record, he's now in the seminary. This is from a teacher from Sanborn that I know pretty well. We've implemented the Common Core in New Hampshire, and it requires me to spend a lot of time on the road talking about the Common Core. So I know this teacher well. How he describes it is that competency-based education holds each student accountable. So in an English class, he's an English teacher, students must receive a passing grade in all of their competencies. How he described it, if you're a pilot and if you get 100 for takeoffs and 100 for while you're in the middle of the air and a 60 for landing, on average, that would be a passing grade, all right? But you wouldn't probably want to fly with that pilot, correct? And that's how he is describing how he now teaches English. It doesn't, if there's 4 major pieces to an English class, and even if the child has aced A, B, and C, if the 4th one he or she doesn't have it yet, they have to go back and they don't move on until that's proven. Let me just
Okay, Tom, I'm just going to interrupt you real quick. So I want to circle back on sort of the themes that we're hearing and hear a little bit more from our other 2 panelists, and then I would love to hear more student quotes because I think it really brings this to life. Basically, to summarize what I think both of the, again, demand side folks are telling us is that the new paradigm is really focused on students and meeting them where they're at, right? And as we know, that's not necessarily how our traditional education system for over a century has been designed. So turning to sort of the entrepreneurs and vendors, for lack of a better word, in the room, I want to think about how we can use new tools to support that new paradigm. So first off, we have Renee Foster, who's the president of Curriculum Associates, which is a large assessment company based here in Massachusetts. And we also have Claudia Reuter, who is now running the lab at Houghton Mifflin, but previously was the founder and CEO of School Chapters, which is a sort of portfolio assessment company that was acquired by Houghton Mifflin. So I'm going to start with Renee, because as we've heard from teachers and from Alison and from Tom, if what students need to know and how they're going to demonstrate it is somehow different, assessment radically changes. So how are you, both in your role, but maybe your read on kind of the assessment market, thinking about this slice of the education market that's trying to do competency-based education?
Sure. Great. Thanks, Julie. So we actually focus on assessment and instruction, but for this purpose, I'm going to focus on the assessment market because I think there's some pretty important changes in the needs for assessment in schools that are attempting to do competency-based learning. We focus largely on the K-8 market, and I will say up front that, this movement is very small in K-8 right now. However, what we do see, and I'll talk about that more later when we talk about questions around the market, is that the trends that are driving us towards competency-based learning in a lot of places are also driving trends that are bigger in K-8 that have similar needs. So I think that really expands the market for things people are doing that are based on needs for competency-based learning. But just starting with assessment needs, so one of the first things you talked about here, Claire, was the diagnostics. So, right now, if you look at the K-8 education system, majority of districts are focused on evaluations and benchmarks that are evaluating students on these large assessments throughout the year based on their grade level standards. So sixth graders are being evaluated against all their sixth grade standards. As you move towards a model where you're trying to figure out exactly where students are and place them into exactly the right spot in a learning progression or sequence, you need to break up that grade level perspective and really be evaluating them on that K-8 or K-12 continuum. And in order to do that, you need adaptive assessments that can actually, efficiently and effectively drill down to a student's specific needs by not just subject, but domain and within a learning progression. And those types of assessments are really important for getting an effective placement for these students and being able to effectively group students. The other thing that's needed is more focus on sort of rigorous, bite-sized formative assessments. So, if the idea is I want to be able to measure a student at skill by skill level before I have them progress, then I need assessments that are rigorous and that are valid and reliable against those independent chunks. And if you look at how, the skills are measured typically today in the school system in K-8, there's quizzes or teacher developed assessments and unit assessments that, are either inconsistent, don't match the rigor, don't have data behind them. But in order to have an effective competency-based learning program, you have to have those really strong formative assessments. The third piece is, as her articulation about the students in New Hampshire and the types of ways that they are demonstrating their proficiency. You're talking about evaluating much more complex sets of skills and capabilities than you see in a traditional assessment environment today. These are not skills you're evaluating in multiple choice, but there's more of a reliance in these environments on, performance-based tasks and research projects. And as you think about making it possible to efficiently evaluate that kind of work, it's different types of supports and automation and assessment and different types of supports and allowing for consistent teacher-based evaluation of those types of projects. And I would say, the fourth thing on the assessment side, which connects to all of those, is a big change in use of data and reporting. So if you think about, historically, the focus of assessment data is how to inform district-level personnel on how schools are progressing towards their end-of-year proficiency rates, right? And identifying big chunks of problems, right? As you're thinking about, my third grade math, is a real problem area. You can see you need to focus more there. With these types of assessments, you're really trying to bring it much more down to the teacher level and to the student level. And I'll start with the student level because I think that's the biggest gap with where you see information delivered in the typical school environment today and what you're aiming for in the new competency-based model, which is, the real focus on student-directed learning in these methods means that the students really need a lot of very specific information about where they are and how they're doing, and they need it delivered to them in ways that are going to motivate them to be self-directed and to know what they need to do. And those types of student dashboards, unfortunately, I would say today, and just in a typical K-8 environment, just don't exist. And I think they're important regardless of what approach you're taking. But I think really thinking about what you're doing with assessment data, your reporting you need to have a reporting focus on students as well as your admins. And then, of course, in the middle, you have educators who are now, managing classrooms where they're actively trying to support the needs of students at multiple different levels, and not only starting at different levels, but are progressing at different paces. And that's a management need, and using the types of like short bite formative assessments and diagnostic assessments, but really translating that data into how do I think about grouping and regrouping my students regularly, moving them around into different, more modular type learning environments and structures in an efficient way, requires a new level of information delivered in the teacher in ways that are really useful. So, a few thoughts.
No, that's super helpful. And what we're going to come back to is if I were an entrepreneur, which of those 4 categories you'd encourage me to pick off first. Relatedly, though, Claudia, you a number of years ago saw, I think, in that third bucket of students demonstrating mastery through alternative sort of modes and methods, you saw that opportunity when you built basically a portfolio. You tell me what to call it. I would call it a portfolio sort of assessment company. But walk us through where you saw that gap in the market and how it relates to competency-based learning, maybe in the high school or K-8, but also in higher ed.
Sure, happy to. I don't know, is my mic working okay?
Tell us, can you hear her?
Okay. So, taking a step back, when we're talking about competency-based learning, at its core, we're really talking about, when we talk about is there mastery, we're talking about is there evidence, right? Is there evidence of learning, and what does that look like? And I actually started school chapters focused on looking at some of the processes that teachers and educators were facing on a daily basis that were at that point primarily covered through paper-based methods. And when we started it, I was looking at early childhood education in particular, where they are often going through various accreditation processes. Now, this isn't about competency-based learning, but this is about taking evidence of what's happening in your classroom and aligning it to key standards and criteria. And then based on how those alignments are made, assessors come out and evaluate if your program is of quality. So we started working with the National Association for the Education of Young Children to basically look at ways that we could help replace traditional paper-based methods where they were building out binders and taking up a ton of time, and really help transform the way they're doing that with technology. And so what we started looking at was not how can we take this one process and create a siloed web application to support this one process, but how can we look at the evidence that they are using and come up with a system that will allow a user to align it to multiple standard sets. So what we saw was that the same photograph of a child who was using a pencil and writing might in fact be evidence that you provide a literacy-rich environment, which is a key, standard that you might be trying to meet to show that your program's of quality. But that might also be really good evidence that that child has strong fine motor skills developing. And so what we did is we looked at each piece, the artifacts, and how we could tag that to multiple standards. And what we found over time is that people were adopting this program to use for accreditation and to start to look at ways to communicate with families about what was happening with the individual children, all while the teacher only had to upload something once. The teacher only had to go through one step, which was, I'm providing a high-quality experience, and how does this relate? And we found that over 20% of our users were actually higher ed customers actually who were on college campuses, because college campuses often have a child care center. And so we started looking at that and talking to the folks who were running these labs and using our software in that way and asking, what else we could do, and realized that that same problem, that fundamental nature of taking evidence and aligning it across multiple standards existed in higher ed in their accreditation processes, and it also was fundamental to competency-based learning. So basically that was our mission, our goal, and now I'm in HMH, and we're looking at how this kind of actually assessment agnostic platform can be tied to multiple different types of systems.
She makes it sound really effortless. I will say one interesting insight as I've looked at the edtech market trying to support competency-based systems, the brilliance of that model is that it also had a compliance function, and it's really difficult to align competency-based tools to our compliance sort of needs in K-12 right now to be able to report up to states based on a sort of competency-based progression. So really brilliant insight on your part. So I want to come back to Alison. As you're hearing about these tools, and I've talked to you about this many times before, there is, realistically talking, a dearth of tools in the competency-based space because, as Renee said, this is still a pretty small market. So have you been able to find tools that support the work that you're doing in this new paradigm?
So So at our school, and Julia knows this about our school, we were doing this before the software was out there. We're a small school, small classes. It's really important for our students to have that relationship with their teacher. And I want to echo what Tom was saying. His quotes are really powerful because what happens at the outcome of a competency-based model is real student ownership of the learning. Renee's talk of the assessment, absolutely. Rigor as we get ready for the Common Core is essential. It's not, so we look at a lot of our assessments using, looking at the DOK, the depth of knowledge, and making sure that students are demonstrating at that higher level of thinking. And so one of the big differences between a competency-based model and a standards-based model, and those are two different things. Competency-based model takes the Common Core and goes like this with it. And it does that because it pulls out the essential understandings. And when you pull out the essential understandings and you teach those, you have time to teach them well and deeply. And if you teach them well and deeply, then the student can demonstrate them and you build their confidence and so forth. So the assessment aspect of it is really crucial. We can't be asking students to do recall. We have to get them to think and to demonstrate that. And that builds their confidence and their self-esteem. So I love that she's talking about that. The big piece that we haven't found, and it's maybe coming up, Jump Rope I know is getting close to doing this. If you can move to the next slide. So again, we've been doing this for a really long time. And Renee mentioned that it's a continuum of learning that we're talking about. We're not talking about grouping things by grade levels. And so a lot of the software for the data collection is still really on a yearly basis, on a time basis. That's the student information systems at the end of the year end, and then the systems start up again, so Power School and a lot of those systems. So the one thing that we've had to custom design, and we're on to our second custom design, we're using Salesforce for education, which is a really great model because our staff can manipulate it. And so what I'm showing you is just a screenshot of one of our pages on Salesforce that our staff designed with consultants. And it's basically the roadmap to graduation. And it shows all those blocks are the courses. They're 11-week, the courses that the students take. And so again, it's for humanities. It's at the time the student enters until they graduate. So what are the graduation requirements for each discipline? And I know different software programs are doing things like this, but what's different about this is that it's through the lifetime of the student at the school. This isn't a one-year snapshot. The other thing that's missing is the flexibility in these systems. So we have the flexibility for each of these courses to align the competencies that our school has designed for our students that are very mission-driven. So there's that flexibility of manipulating the courses and putting the competencies in each course. And then when the student demonstrates mastery of those competencies, they move on to that next course. We rotate and reshuffle our students every trimester. We're still using pretty archaic systems because there's not a system out there that reshuffles the kids based on the advancement. So in some of these models, our students are in classes where we're really emphasizing the social aspect of learning. And so we want to reshuffle those that have advanced into the next class, and those that are still working, they stay back and they keep working on that class. And so we haven't found a system yet that is that powerful to collect that data from our teachers and reorganize it.
Great example. So Tom, likewise, can you sort of speak to in New Hampshire where you're seeing tools help or hurt your cause?
Absolutely. Now, I think you all would agree that it's people before technology. So the teachers that I interviewed are all teachers that get the big picture of competency-based learning. So I'm going to give you some 360 real-world feedback, which you may or may not want to hear. We first have one sort of overarching problem in New Hampshire is that a lot of school districts are tied into longer-term contracts with various student information systems. So just from an economics perspective, they can't migrate to whatever innovative software there might be on competency-based learning. So we have that sort of, now that will go away with time, obviously. Okay, so now, again, these are just comments from teachers who are into this field. So here we go. So we've been frustrated by lack of products to support competency-based systems. We've had to write our own adjustments to Power School, which is less than ideal. We've started working with KnowledgeWorks regarding this need, but don't see something new on the horizon. We'd also like to have a system for following our students for 5 to 10 years out, sort of that holistic view. And then I'll continue on. This is at Sanborn. We use Pinnacle Gradebook at Sanborn, which allows us to record not just the final grade of an assignment, but also links each of the competencies to the assignments. This product has a lot of pros and cons, but there needs to be a lot more work in this area of creating the electronic gradebook. For example, the amount of information that a teacher has to input is really overwhelming. And this particular teacher wants also that the software allows both students and parents to view the competency work in a way that the parents can understand. I have a lot of other quotes from kids who say, my parent just doesn't get it. They're used to the old school where, A, B, what is this narrative, they want. So we also have to get, this is why it's a cultural thing beyond technology. We have to get parents comfortable with a narrative grade. We have to get universities comfortable that, with that.
Tom, on that topic, have you seen any promising practices in New Hampshire to sort of get communities rallied around this?
I think, Pittsfield, New Hampshire is the best example, and because what they did to get to competency-based, they got the whole community involved. They got the parents, they got the shop owners on Main Street, they got the police, the fire, the teachers, younger siblings. So the whole community's involved, and so they're totally behind this. But I just wanted to give you that honest feedback that in the practicing, and there's many other examples I could give you, but the practicing teachers who are truly doing this in a genuine way aren't really at this point satisfied with the software. And of course, then the other issue that the parents keep asking them is quote unquote, how do students submit to colleges a legitimate, validated portfolio of competency assessment as opposed to, my grade point average is 3.7 or whatever. So those are sort of the environmental obstacles, that are out there. But they're making. Someone mentioned Salesforce. That's one school's using that. I mean, they're making do with what they have. But if there was a super duper product out there, I think it would certainly have a place.
So that echoes one point I hope that the audience can take away, which is that when we put the mastery-based or competency-based stamp on a software product, it's not necessarily aligning to the needs that we're hearing articulated on this panel. So I think, again, for the entrepreneurs in the room, that's a helpful reminder. Okay, real quick, I want Renee and Claudia to give your advice to entrepreneurs, and then we're going to do questions. So where you see around the corner sort of the biggest gaps in this space and where you think that we need more talent from the entrepreneurial sector. If you don't like that question.
That's great. No, so one of the things I would say is that, competency-based education is a small sliver of the market, but I would say a lot of the needs that are actually being expressed are tools and things that would help in larger issues that more traditional K-8 environments are facing. So maybe take adaptive assessment for a moment. When we first came out with adaptive assessment 3 years ago, I was explaining it to everybody. Not that some didn't already exist, but it just wasn't broadly understood. And that those tools are important not just for competency-based education, but are making a big impact on traditional environments. So I'd say, look for crossover places in the market where you could probably help both directions. And I'd say there's a few things there that are on my mind. One is this concept of student-directed learning and student motivation. I would say historically, because the educational publishing market doesn't sell to students, there's been a big gap in how well publishers design tools to motivate and inform students. And I would say, just in thinking about the business models for this this market in general, like I think there is more opportunity to license new technology and content to publishers directly. And in models, I mean, we've worked with people in models around, per student license fees and things. And so looking for areas where, I think more traditional companies may have, are not adapting quickly enough, but would like to add those types of features and functionality. What they're doing could be an opportunity. So one thing would be things that deal with, information to students in ways that really will drive student taking more control of their learning and the motivation effort. Other thing is classroom management tools. So there are some specific needs that are different in competency-based education, but in general, we're seeing in the K-8 environment, classrooms know that they have students in 6th grade that are 3rd, 4th, 5th grade levels in different places, and there's a lot more work going on in trying to group those students, have more modular learning environments, moving students between small groups, independent learning, teacher-directed learning, and tools that really deliver information and are constantly giving you better data on where your students are, helps with those differentiated learning efforts that more traditional systems are trying to implement that aren't as, they aren't as far along as what we're doing in competency-based education, but, there is a focus on trying to do those things. So I have a longer list, but I'll stop there for now.
Yeah. And I think our panelists, we're going to be short on time, so folks will be around to answer questions afterwards. Claudia, where do you weigh in on this?
I just think, one of the biggest issues that's being faced in K-12 right now is really around integration. You mentioned how you might have an SIS that you're just not going to get out of that contract, and it's unreasonable to think that you're going to come in as a startup and replace that. So one of the things that we really focused on was, okay, if the data and the artifacts are going to be tied to the user and that student, then it doesn't really matter what grade they're in, or it's more, what system they're in. And then our objective became, how can we make sure that we integrate with systems that people are already using? So we developed a series of APIs, and we actually do tie-ins to most of the major LMSs and did a lot of work. So we didn't just focus on our siloed process. We focused on how can we make sure we work with Blackboard, Canvas, Moodle, Sakai, the SISs. And that really leads to a lot more confidence buy-in. And I think in K-12, what I'm seeing is that there's such opportunity for tools and resources that will help the teacher experience with software, not, with just one more piece of, tools to use, but how does that go into the teacher's daily experience and the other tools that she or he is already using?
Great. Okay, now turning to you. Question in the front row, Mallory.
Hi, thank you very much. I'd love to hear you all talk about coordination complexity, how you've dealt with, students are moving at their own pace, for example, how you're managing oversight of kids taking all of these different internships for credit, or how if in a classroom kids are working on 15 different projects, you make collaboration possible. So just what coordination complexity you've seen and how people are dealing with it.
Just really quickly, that's why we broke our classes into 11-week modules, and we don't have kids working on 15 different projects. So in the old days, we did 15 different packets, which is kind of like what the online classes allow for, is 15 different. So our big focus at our school is to not do that, and so is to think about ways to differentiate the instruction so that, and again, keeping kids in smaller modules of learning, so that students are learning with each other. So we do a lot of station rotation. If the students are off in different paces, they'll work at a table, all the students that are all at the same place, but we would never want, that spread out of a situation.
Quickly, your question was beautiful, because that, when I meet with teachers, that's their first comment. I don't have an easy answer to that, but that's a question that all the teachers raise. We do. Teachers have various ways of dealing with it. We also have in New Hampshire something called the Virtual Learning Academy, VLAX. It's been pretty well known, and that's really helped almost eliminate the dropout rate in New Hampshire, which was one of our goals way back in 2007, and that is systemically virtual learning, where you're not moving on until it's proven, and that is staffed behind the scenes, so to speak. So I think VLAX is our best example of competency-based that works, and if your goal is to get more kids graduating, it has worked like a charm.
More questions? Oh. Right?
It seems like one of the phrase someone said at the beginning about the difference between competency-based and standards-based, that what I'm struggling with is it seems like it's often just a question of grain size or chunk size, which is typical grades or Carnegie units are year-long or maybe semester-long, and then you're talking about 11-week modules. But if you look at what's up there right now, which is a really helpful visual, one could argue those are just like Carnegie units, except it's just in smaller chunks. But perhaps the other element is around the fact that you can get a C in Algebra 1 and then move on to Algebra 2, versus perhaps in your minds is a fundamental distinction. You have to get a quote, what would be the equivalent of an A or some other minimal level before you go to Algebra 2. So beyond just the chunk size, sort of what's the chunk size seems to cause all of the issues with the integration with systems, but what's different in your minds about the actual sort of educational process?
You're absolutely, and so it's a refocus on what we on grading, and so there's been some great articles written about that. That's really what we're talking about, is a shift in how we grade students. And so a C, what does a C mean, and what does an A mean? So in a competency-based model, so we have a BC up there, which is, we had to do some different structures so that it could go into a transcript for college. A BC is basic competent, and that's your equivalent of a C. But in a competency-based school, that basic competent means that I have mastered the competencies for that class. It doesn't mean that I scored a 70% on my final exam, which really doesn't define how much I know. So that's a really good clarifier.
Just quick follow-up, is that the notion of, I think it was Tom who said, the pilot example. So the C in the Carnegie unit would be a pilot who might have got 100 on flying and a 60 on landing, versus a BC in the competency model is really, they are basically competent in landing and flying, so you know that that pilot will not crash the plane, even if they may not be the best pilot overall. Does that capture it?
And Mike, yeah, I mean that's a good. And I also want to let you know, it kind of goes back to the first question too, which is that we do provide a lot of guidance to teachers on how this grading philosophy works. And as a reminder, you can, in that example, that the student could relearn the landing piece of the action without being penalized in effect. So.
Question over here.
Hi, I have just sort of a basic definition kind of a question about, it seems like switching from seat hours to competence would imply that some kids are going to finish much sooner than others, and in some subjects rather than others, and other kids are going to stay in school a lot more than 4 years, or maybe lots more than 4 years in English but not in math. And so I'm wondering, in New Hampshire or in BDEA, is that actually playing out that way? Do you have people who, they come in as 14-year-olds and you're like, you know what? A month later, I can tell you actually know all the, science you need to know, but you don't know the English. And how are you actually adjusting the lengths of time that kids spend in subjects? And if so, how are you doing that?
Okay, so I will take that. In our minimum standards, there's not the 180-day requirement. So you're correct. It's about competency. It's not seat-based. And what's happening is not longer, but shorter times. And I think that's ultimately going to help students get into community colleges. In New Hampshire, the economics is very important. 1 year less of college tuition maybe is the difference between me going to college or not. So what we've seen actually is less time in high school. That brings in a whole host of new other issues, teachers unions, and then my kid doesn't play the spring high school sport and things like that. But for the moment, it hasn't extended time out. It is actually shortened, with the exception of VLAX, which I mentioned, the online learning, which has gotten old students who've in effect dropped out back in, but they don't quote unquote graduate from high school until they prove all the competencies.
Alison, you want to quickly weigh in? Yeah, I think I think you're asking both a pragmatic policy question and a deeply philosophical question about whether students should be going further or deeper as they advance, or whether they should just go on to something post high school. I think we're still working out that answer, and New Hampshire is again at the edge. I apologize, this is such a short session. In my mind, competency-based education, the more you talk about, the more complicated it gets. So I hope you're not leaving totally dissatisfied, but we'll be up here to answer questions and enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thank you. That was a good